Recollections of Mount Athos by Archimandrite Cherubim Karambelas, with an introduction by Bishop Maximus, as published by Holy Cross Orthodox Press, 1987. Dedicated to the saintly fathers of the Holy Mountain, whose lives bless and sanctify our Holy Orthodox Church and our broken and divided world for over 1,000 years. Forward. During these times of confusion regarding the hierarchy of values, a breath of fresh air comes to our corrupt society from the depths of the Holy Orthodox tradition, as exemplified in monasticism. Monastics have always kept straight the hierarchy of values, seeking first God's holy kingdom and his righteousness, encouraging people who strive for quality spiritual life in the world not to allow any obstacles to come between them and God. This present book is offered to the reader as an example of this monastic spirituality. Archimandrite Cherubim Karambelas, the founder of the Parakletos Monastery in Oropos, Attica, Greece, shares with the reader his recollections of the Holy Mountain. The St. Gregory Palamas Monastery in Hayesville, Ohio, under the jurisdiction of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of Pittsburgh and the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America, offers this book to the reader for his enlightenment regarding Orthodox monastic spirituality. The text is preceded by a preface from the translators and an introductory chapter on monasticism in the Orthodox Church. Both of these are important for the understanding of the main text. This book is the first in a series of books on monastic spirituality. God willing, more books of this kind will be made available to readers eager to become familiar with the treasures of an age-old Christian experience, the noblest that this world has seen, the experience of those for whom Christ is all and in all. Colossians 3:11. Signed, Bishop Maximus. Translator's Preface. This book springs from the author's own personal monastic experience on Mount Athos, the Holy Mountain. Archimandrite Cherubim Karambelas spent only 4 years on Mount Athos. He was 18 years old when he went to the Holy Mountain with the intention of staying there forever. As fate would have it, however, he was forced, due to ill health, to return to wartime Athens. He was not to return to the mountain again until many years later, and then only to visit a dying monk, a friend, who wished to see him before he died. At that time he was the abbot of the Holy Monastery of the Paraclete, which he established, located on the outskirts of Athens. Truly amazing is the fact that after 40 years, Father Cherubim was able to remember and so vividly describe his recollections of the people and the places that he had met and visited on the Holy Mountain. However, that which really attracts our attention is his uncanny ability to recreate the events that took place there and the teachings derived from them. How deeply embedded is his youthful heart these must have been, and what an impact they must have had made on his life for him to have locked them like priceless gems in the treasury of his heart. There he nurtured them until he felt the time had come to share these gems with others, in the hope that the latter too would profit by them. And so, shortly before his death on August 22nd, 1979, he opened the treasury of his heart and let his precious memories pour forth out to enrich not only monastics but lay people as well. From this book, the reader will get a glimpse, if not an understanding, of monasticism on the Holy Mountain, what it is, what types of monasticism exist there, what a violent monk is. The author tells us how the fathers of the Holy Mountain treat the idea of discipleship, how they deal with obedience, how important the relationship between disciple and elder is, how they treat death and the dying, and more importantly, how they practice the Jesus prayer. In short, what is their spirituality? Like a selective bee that collects only the nectar from choice flowers, Father Cherubim collected the spiritual nectar from the choicest monks that he met on Mount Athos. He preserved it in its pure form, and with it he nurtured not only himself but also his disciples and so many others for 35 years. With the same spirit that Father Cherubim and his successor, Father Timothy, shared this spiritual nectar with others, we, in our own turn, offer this same nourishment to those who may wish to partake of it. in the hope that it will stimulate their commitment to holy orthodoxy, rekindle their love toward the Lord Jesus Christ, bring about a much-needed reawakening of the monastic ideal, and usher in a new and glorious page in the history of our Church in America. We have decided to help the reader understand some technical terms unique to Orthodox monasticism by appending a short glossary of some of them at the end of this book. There were some other technical difficulties which we encountered with certain key words that recur throughout the book. One such example was the treatment of the Greek word Panagia, which literally means the All-Holy One, and is used as a proper name referring to the Virgin Mary, the birth-giver of God, Our Lady the Theotokos. In order to preserve that meaning, we decide not to translate it. To further explain her importance for Athonite monks, it is necessary to say a few words about the Holy Mountain, which is her special domain. The Holy Mountain is the southeastern tip of the Chalkidiki Peninsula, also known as Mount Athos, from the name of its highest peak. It is a famous center of Orthodox monasticism and is over 1,000 years old, which is comprised of 20 sovereign monasteries as well as many dependencies, sketes, kelia, kathismata, etc. According to the local Hagirite tradition, the Holy Mountain is the personal garden of the Panagia, the Holy Theotokos, and her son's special gift to her. She is the Queen of Athos, the protectress and sovereign of all the monasteries there. That is why the monks have a special love and devotion for her. Another term that was very difficult to translate was the Greek word hypotaktikos, a monk who freely submits his will to that of his elder. Indeed, all monks at the time of their tonsure take a vow of obedience to their elder and spiritual father. We decided to render it in English as disciple, since this word implies discipline and rigor, fully realizing, however, that it does not capture the entire meaning. Actually, there is no exact equivalent in English. The reader, however, should not see the disciple and his elder in a student-teacher relationship when he encounters these words in the text, not even in a son-father relationship. As many elders and church fathers point out, the disciple is to see his elder as his God after God, St. Simeon the New Theologian. These church fathers even make the parallelism with God, Moses, Israelites in the Holy Bible. Just as the Israelites at the time of the Exodus had to speak to God only through Moses, and again God made his will manifest to them through Moses, so the elder interprets the will of God for the disciple. For this reason, there must never be anything in the life of the disciple of which the elder is not fully aware. The elder need not be older than his disciple. He may be the abbot of a monastery, the elder of a skete or Kalyva, or just a hermit living alone in the desert. Often the elder may have his blood brother or even his father as his disciple. The good disciple is the one who applies himself rigorously by striving hard to constrain his own nature constantly, remembering the Lord's words, "The kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force," Matthew 11:12. This is the meaning of the word violent monk, or fighting monk, as it is used in the book. We realize that, while it may seem awkward to the English-speaking reader who has been exposed only to the negative and pejorative connotation of the word, at the same time it is accurate in its positive meaning, and it is precisely this that a monk will spend a lifetime to attain. Still, another word which gave us some difficulty was the term father. All monks are generally addressed as father, as are the priests, but not all monks are priests. This can become confusing in a list of several monks, of whom only a few are ordained priests. We decided, therefore, to keep the Greek word papa followed by the name as an affectionate way of addressing ordained priests only, while referring to simple monks as fathers. We were not consistent, however, for once the identity and title of an individual was clearly established, we reverted back to the common English form of address, father. We made every effort to preserve the author's style and use of the Greek idiom, but when it was not possible, we exercised our own discretion, For this we ask the reader's indulgence. We ask and wish to express our sincere gratitude to everyone who helped make this book possible. We especially wish to thank His Grace Maximos, Bishop of Pittsburgh, for his interest and continuous encouragement in our undertaking, and for graciously offering to write the introduction. We also wish to express our sincere appreciation to the Very Reverend Archimandrite Timothy, Abbot of the Holy Monastery of the Paraclete, and the author's successor for his kindness in permitting us to translate this book. We offer this book, then, to our readers, to the glory of our triune God, in honor of His Most Holy Mother, the protectress of all Hagirite monasticism, and in memory of its author, Father Cherubim. Chapter 1. First Impressions. August 6th, 1983. The ship Samos is completing its dull itinerary. Piraeus, Alexandroupoli, Kavala, Thessaloniki. It will pass by many islands, and it will stop in many ports. I am one of its passengers. When we left from Kavala and traveled toward Thessaloniki, the last stop of the ship, the conical mass of Athos began to make its appearance from afar. Leaning on the gunwale of the bow, I had fastened my eyes on Athos as it emerged from the sea with all its grandeur. I felt its attraction so strongly that I was searching for a way to push the ship so that it would arrive more quickly. But we did not delay in approaching. The monasteries appeared one by one, huge forts built there to witness the eternal expression of man's faith and course towards God. From the time I was 14 years old, the vivid descriptions of two Hagirite hero monks who were rigorous in practicing the virtues, the elders Paisios and Chrysanthos, had molded Mount Athos in my soul like a place that, though terrestrial, touches heaven. My burning desire for that place urged me to the big decision. I was going to live there forever. It was a trip which I alone had decided to take without anyone knowing about it. We docked in Daphne. Some rowboats approached the ship to take the passengers. As soon as my foot stepped on land, my first concern was to kneel behind an old building and with emotion kiss that holy ground. I had vowed to do it. I used to say, "My Panagia, enable me one day to find myself on the holy mountain, and the first thing I will do will be to kiss its holy ground." I started out for Piraeus, the capital of the holy mountain, where I would obtain a permit, an indispensable provision for every pilgrim. As I was walking, I could not see enough of the thick, endless forests and fountains with their crystalline waters. Such haste, such curiosity took hold of me to see, to hear, to learn as much as possible about that holy place, which had so touched me, had so magnetized me from the time I was a young child. When I saw some monks who happened to be on my road, laden with knapsacks on their backs, and with prayer ropes in hand, it revived in me everything that I had heard during my youth. Piraeus was plunged in green. Its perfumed air was spreading coolness into the scorching August. I spent that night in an inn. It was my first night on the holy mountain. In the morning, I set out on foot again toward Daphne. There I saw a mixture of fishermen, monks, policemen, and laborers. The one who impressed me the most was the now deceased George, the one-time Athonite guard, with his long white beard and the two-headed eagle that adorned his cap. The activity and life of Daphne created a sadness in me that I was unable to define. Within the crowd I discerned a polite and charming monk. He approached me with a great deal of kindness and said to me, "Perhaps I may be of service to you." Although I wanted to hide my destination, I did not succeed. I told him that I was planning to go to Kalyva. Some time ago, a friend of mine who became a monk had gone there, and I wanted to visit him. Then joyfully he informed me that he, too, belonged to the Skidi of Kalyva, and that he lived in the Kalyva of St Methodius. That monk, as I later found out, was Papa Methodius. A little later, we set out with the motorboat that went as far as the Skete of St. Anne. For the duration of the trip, sometimes I marveled at nature's beauty, and sometimes I examined closely the passengers of the small boats, monks, laborers, and pilgrim. My attention was easily captivated by some ascetic features who you could see were silent and taciturn, a sign that even on their trips they walk the road towards self-knowledge and self-conquest. I cited first the holy monastery of St. Gregory. What hadn't I heard about this monastery? It was one of the better Cenobitic monasteries and had strict monks. In a little while I turned to the left, and I saw up high the gigantic building of Simenopetra. Before I could recover from that surprise, the holy monastery of Dionysiou suddenly appeared. I was moved spontaneously. Amongst the treasures there were the right hand of St. John the Forerunner, and the relics of St. Nephon, Patriarch of Constantinople, who had the menial task of a mule herder. "My God," I said, "where am I? Is all this real?" As I faced the monastery of Dionysiou and brought to mind everything I had heard about it, I felt something within me. At every monastery, someone always would jump ashore. If he was a monk, I would try to guess. I wonder if he's one of those about whom I had heard so many good things. After the monastery of Dionysiou, right at the foot of the highest peak of Athos, the holy monastery of St. Paul began to appear. From the sea it seemed a marvelous group of buildings. It resembled an old Venetian fortress. The holy gifts which the Magi had offered to the incarnated Lord are guarded like priceless treasures in that monastery. In a little while we faced Newskeet, a pretty little monastic town with picturesque Kalyvas and beautiful gardens. We left it behind us, and in approximately 10 minutes we arrived at the last moorage of our trip, St. Anne. With obvious curiosity I looked and looked at it again. I cast my gaze from the lowest to the highest houses. Would it be as Fathers Paisios and Chrysanthos, who were from there, had described it to me? In the dock, some plane trees offered rich shade to the visitors. I too sat in their shadow. A little further away, a monk was digging lightly in the sand and in the shells. Later on, he took an old can and bent over it to fill it with water. I ran close to him to see what he was doing. I too asked to taste that water. It was perhaps the most delicious water I have ever had in my life. A little further up, at a distance of approximately 100 meters from the sea, a cool spring darted out. Since I found myself in St. Anne with the guidance of a monk, I started out for the Kalyva of St. John the Forerunner. I wanted to meet the elder Azariah and his two blood brothers under him, John and Averkios. With my guide we went over steep footpaths, which from time to time were covered by enormous tall trees. He did not utter a single word during the entire trip. On his back he carried his knapsack. In one hand he held the staff, and in another a worn-out prayer rope. He led the way, and I followed. He was muttering something with his lips. Of course he must have been saying the Jesus prayer. Respecting his state of contemplation, I didn't interrupt him, even though there was so much I longed to ask him. I found myself in St. Anne. It was like a dream, an illusion. We turned onto a small path inside the thick bushes, where the fragrance of myrtle and bay trees prevailed. We passed by some very tall beanstalks and found ourselves in front of a village door. We climbed up 2 or 3 steps and pulled on a rope, which had an empty spool tied on the other end of it. A bell was heard. In a little while the door opened, and a middle-aged monk appeared clad in a worn cassock, barefoot and with a cap that appeared frayed. His face beamed with a charming, childlike simplicity. At first he looked at me curiously and said, "Would you be George?" "Yes. How did you recognize me?" "I knew you from your features. That's how my brother, Father John, had described you to me." After the acknowledgment, we thanked my guide, whom I never saw again during my stay on the Holy Mountain. I would have liked very much to have seen him. His appearance disclosed a monastic figure gathered within himself. We entered into an old and simple area, which probably also served as the entrance to the chapel. Father Averkios, that was the name of the monk who had welcomed me, opened the door of the church so that I might say a prayer. The chapel was named in honor of St. John the Forerunner. I kissed all the icons of the iconostasis with great awe. For the first time I was entering a Hagioite chapel. My attention was drawn to the stall in the right choir, which had been converted into a chanter's stand, the unique lantern, the aged Byzantine icons, the stalls with their unique double-seat feature, the incense, the candle, and oil emitted their characteristic scents. My joy was great. Before me stood Father Verkios, about whom I had heard so much from his brother, and the singular fact about him was that he had been on the holy mountain since he was 9. From that time on, he never saw the world again. He never came out into vanity. After the church, we went into their simple and humble guest room. He ran to bring me the usual Hagioite treat: Turkish delight, coffee, and arak. At the same time, I heard footsteps on the stairs. I presumed that it would be Father John. Indeed, it seems he heard my voice and was coming down now to welcome me. He was holding a bouquet of flowers in his hands. "The holy mountain welcomes you with its pretty flowers," he said to me. This unexpected welcome impressed me. I thought that the cultured monk, in addition to everything else, was also a noble soul. After a little while, the unforgettable saintly figure of Elder Azariah appeared. He was now 75 years old, but he had the complexion and bearing of a young child. Such people have their entrance into the kingdom of heaven guaranteed. According to the word of the Lord, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 18:3. Elder Azariah said but 2 words and rang the bell for the 9th hour of Vespers. I sat in the stall and considered myself truly happy. My youthful heart swelled. The simple and brief chanting, the devout attitude of the fathers, the entire environment created in me such exaltation that I said to myself, what more, what better can a soul ask for than this holy atmosphere? Dinner followed Vespers, a simple, well-cooked meal and delicious peaches from the garden. Father Azariah, according to what his monks told me, busied himself with gardening and fishing. When the compline was finished too, we all bowed to the elder and received his blessing. At night, even though I was very tired from the trip, I couldn't wait for the bell to ring so that I could find myself again inside that chapel with the dim light and the oil lamps, with the lantern that illuminated the service books and the figures of the 3 fathers, whose presence spread serenity and inner joy. It was the first matins I attended on the holy mountain. That's why it will be unforgettable for me. I would very much wish that I could relive the spiritual state of that ATHOS, even now that I am writing these lines 41 years later. After ATHOS, we drank our coffee, and then Father Verkios took me to see their garden and orchard, overloaded peach trees and well-kept rows of summer vegetables, and other garden greens. Everything demonstrated the order and harmony which was in the mind and soul of the fathers. We cut a few peaches and went back. We visited the icon workshop and the rest of the dwelling, which resembled an old, well-kept village house. I was sitting on the balcony when I heard footsteps. I turned and I saw old Father Azariah with his fishing gear in his hands and a small basket filled with fresh, wiggling fish. He caught them just a while ago with the net that he had tossed out the night before. I lived 5 or 6 days close to that holy group with feelings of enthusiasm, joy, and spiritual fullness. During that time, we went with Father John to pray in the Kyriakon. The Dikeos of the Skeet at that time was the now deceased Papa Harlambos of the Kalyva of St Modestos. Order and cleanliness prevailed in the church, which was entirely decorated with Byzantine icons. With deep emotion, I venerated the holy relics of St. Anne with her miraculous icon, and I whispered to her a few words of thanks for having enabled me to come to this holy place, which I had so loved even before I had known it. The Kyriakon is approximately in the center of the skeet, and from there one can see the 54 Kalyvas which form it. My eyes and mine were filled with the pictures of the skeet Kalyvas with their trees, springs, gardens, but mostly with their complete silence and serenity. There were so many people in that little village, and not a sound was heard. No noise, no disturbance. Silence is the best companion for monastic life. After leaving the church, we visited the Kalyva of the Kartsonas brothers. There I encountered monastic dignity. They welcomed us with joy and impulsive spontaneity. The group was made up of 4 blood brothers, Papa Gabriel, the elder of the Kalyva, Papa Seraphim, Papa Dionysios, and the monk Chrysostom. They had come to the mountain when they were very young children. Their own father had brought them and dedicated them to the Panagia. Old Kartsonas, with his kilt and leather belt, was one of the more prominent mayors of Messenia. His children took with them the dignity of their origin and preserved it up until the end. They were not only iconographers, but also artists. As we were leaving, they bid us farewell with an abounding love that I have never forgotten. To their death, they remained faithful to the vows which they made at the time of their tonsure. They had many and great acquaintances, but they would not change their Hygierite life for anything. May God grant them rest. May we have their blessing. Chapter 2, A Short Trip. It was time for me to leave for Kalyva. As I had mentioned before, I wanted to visit my friend and classmate who had become a monk in the Kalyva of the Iosafides. One afternoon I went down to the moorage of St. Anne, and with the little motorboat I was in Kalyva in 1 hour. During our trip we passed below Koroulia and Katanakia. It was a dry and rocky place. The hermits live here, I was told. Amazed at the heroism and patience of these people, I stared with admiration. A monk traveling with me showed me a little hut. In there, he said, lives a Russian prince, the hero monk Parthenios. I felt something leap inside me, but I left my visit to those places for another time. At Kalyva, some monks filled with willingness to serve came down also. Indeed, one of them, old Father Timothy, more than 60 years old, with spontaneous love, snatched the luggage from my hands and saddled himself with it. We climbed up on a height from where we suddenly came face to face with all of the completely green skiti of Kalyva. The enormous house of the Iosafides, the iconographers, dominated the center of the skeet. Further up I could make out the Kyriakon with its beautiful high bell tower. My enthusiasm was uncontained. I found myself in Kalyva. Old Timothy, laden with my luggage, and I walked slowly until we reached the courtyard of the Iosaphite mansion. Trees, greenery, flowers, a fountain, and plentiful running water adorned its courtyard. We drew near and knocked on the door. The door was opened by the monk I had met before, who was surprised by this unexpected meeting. Old Timothy put down my luggage, and after we thanked him for his love, he left. We continued on to the church. Its grandeur impressed me. The iconostasis was almost all gold. The icons, painted in the Russian style, were true masterpieces of art. They had been painted by the now deceased great Iosaphite painters. Everything glittered. One was better than the other in order and cleanliness. From the church we went into the formal guest room. This was truly a guest room. It seemed made for nobles. By the time we were seated, the elder of the Kalyva, Father Artimos, arrived with the Fathers John and George. I knew the latter from Piraeus. In the afternoon my friend and I prayed in the Kyriakon. At that time, the now deceased Father Damien was the Dikeos of the skeet. His biblical figure, but especially his advice, helped me greatly. I thought I was flying through the paths of the skeet. Practically the entire skeet is a fortress of trees. We also went into the hermitage of St Akakios, the Kalyvite. In that Kalyva, to my great surprise and joy, we were greeted by old Father Timothy, the monk who had helped me with my luggage. In the meantime, the other members of the group came also, old Father Akakios and Father Hierotheus. Old Akakios, with the wedge-shaped beard and nasal voice, was more than 80 years old. You thought that a Byzantine fresco of an old saint had come unglued and had suddenly appeared before you. Old Hierotheus was Papa Theodore's brother, the former abbot of the Monastery of St Gregory. With his kindness and simplicity, he complemented the beautiful picture of this select group. We took the simple refreshment they offered us with their humble serving pieces, and we enjoyed the endlessness of the Aegean Sea. The view from St. Akakios is truly a panorama. Later we went down to the saint's cave. The footpath that leads there is almost impassable. I went in and venerated the wooden bell on which the saint had rested his ascetic body a little. An enormous tree rises out of the cave, outside the cave. As his biography relates, from time to time a beautiful little bird would come and sit on its branches, and with its sweet voice it would console him during the hours of dejection, during which time the devil often battles with the monks. In the opinion of the fathers who lived there, that little bird was an angel of the Lord. That day we also visited the hut of the benevolent Elder Michael. Old Michael was always a pleasant, smiling man with spontaneous feelings. I stayed in Castle Kalyva about 10 days. I met many of the fathers of the Skete. I also visited the Kalyva of St. Methodius, Elder Cosmas with the priests Damian and Methodius and old Ignatius. His disciples lived there, a solemn group and watchful people, Niptics. How could I forget the Elder Arsenios, the woodcarver, whose fame and work became known to all the spiritual world of Greece, Europe, and even America. For 14 whole years he worked patiently on a masterpiece of wood-carving art, the Second Coming of our Lord, and he worked approximately 10 years on another work of his, the Crucifixion. His artist's soul was hallowed by ascetics. His work was always accompanied by prayer and fasting. In his face you saw the man who lived only for God and who served him with his fine, very fine art. When I met him, he was around 70 years old. He was sitting cross-legged on a low couch. His tools were spread around him. In his hands he held a little piece of wood that usually is used by the wood carvers. His eyes were bright like those of the young child. His pale, wrinkle-free face beamed, while his white beard made him more venerable. Everyone who was blessed by God to meet him was overwhelmed. His wise words came from a holy heart. During the length of my stay in Castle Kalyva, I visited him 2 or 3 times solely to enjoy him. That elder labored only at art and prayer. The other necessities of the Kalyva were covered by Father Epiphanios, his disciple. I also had the honor of meeting the venerable old Anthony, the Hasiopaterite. He had a patristic, ascetic figure distinguished among the Castle Kalyvites. He was pensive and austere. An association with him carried one back to the places of the Egypt and the Thebaid, where monasticism was in its prime. He was wise and proficient in all spiritual problems of monasticism. He had as his disciple Father Anthimos, a grace-filled monk. Each of the fathers of Castle Kalyva, filled with kindness, sought to be the first to take me to his Kalyva, who would be the first to offer me even a cup of coffee. Do not neglect to show hospitality, Hebrews 13:2. If that Christian habit, that cultured, warm human behavior is a characteristic trait of all the Greeks, in the Hagurite monks it is even more evident. However, I stayed too long in Castle Kalyva. I had to pay homage to the monastic center of the holy mountain, the Great Lavra. My monk friend gave me instructions for the footpaths. He told me that I would pass by a remarkable shrine, the cave of St Nilos, the exhaler of myrrh. Just the view of the hermitage produces fear. This is dangerous for anyone who tries to venerate his grave. I had heard that for a time myrrh gushed from his grave and spilled into the sea. The gutters can be seen clearly where the Mer streamed down. There, underneath the cliffs, a lot of sick people went by small boats and were healed. However, the pirates took advantage of that. Many times when the sick people would gather to receive healing, they were taken prisoners and sold in the human marketplaces of the East. In order for this evil to stop, as the Hagurite tradition relates, St Akakios, whose cave is almost across from there, beseeched St Nilos to stop the myrrh and the miraculous healings. From that time on, the myrrh dried up. Perspiring profusely and awe-filled before the abruptness and steepness of the place, I knelt and prayed at the grave of the saint. Later I climbed up to the hut, where I was able to venerate the relic of the jaw of the saints, as well as one of the chasubles he wore when he celebrated the divine liturgy. A brotherhood under St. Nilus from Mytilene was now living a life of asceticism there. When I went there, old Nilos was cutting figs from the fig trees. He offered me some along with coffee and cool water. I didn't have time to stay longer. I said goodbye to the elder and continued my trip toward Lavra. I had heard that at some point between Lavra and Kalyva, St. Peter the Athonite, the first great ascetic of the Holy Mountain, had lived a hermit's life. When I went there, I crossed myself. In his biography, I had read about the promises that Panagia made to him concerning the Holy Mountain. In a little while, a big monastery appeared before me. I had been forewarned that it was the Romanian skete of St. John the Forerunner. I thought that it would be good to venerate the saint, since the opportunity arose, and to see the brother Romanian monks. I passed through the gate and turned toward the church. It was nicely arranged, just like every Catholicon of the Holy Mountain. The entire group of buildings was not in very good condition. One brother directed me to the guest hall, a big room filled with pictures of patriarchs and kings, abbots of the monastery, and so on. Sitting in a corner was a monk who attracted my attention from the first moment. His modest and humble appearance revealed an exceptionally disciplined character. The knapsack, the clean raso, thick monastery shoes, white wool socks, the wool scufo, all bore witness to this. Within me, I felt a strong desire to become acquainted with him, feeling that it concerned a devout monk in whom I could confide my interests about monasticism. I was not successful in conquering my curiosity, and I asked him from which monastery he had come. He answered me with a humble voice and a firm tone, "I am from the holy monastery of Dionysiou." I was thrilled at the mention of that famous cenobium. I wanted to hear as much as possible about it. Enlightened perhaps by God, because good monks always carry within them divine enlightenment, he perceived my desire and answered all my questions with great skill. We did not tire talking, almost by night, about life in that monastery and the spiritual journey of the true monk. As he told me afterwards, he too felt an inner urging to talk with me, and especially to find out if I had monastic interests. His face glowed like an angel's, and the tone of his voice and firm answers to my endless questions had overwhelmed me. I said to myself, I wonder if he is the monk whom I should follow indisputably. But again I hesitated. Let me see something else also, I would say, and then I'll decide. In any event, that meeting of ours was for me a landmark. It was a wonderful introduction to monasticism. When at night the Simantron rang out for Orthos, we hadn't slept yet. We dashed a little water on our faces and went to the service. Romanian chanting sounds a lot like ours. We especially commented on the obvious devoutness of a young priest who was officiating that day. After the divine liturgy, filled with joy and enthusiasm, I said goodbye to old Lazarus, that was the name of the Dionysian monk, with the promise that I would meet him in his monastery. In a half hour I arrived at Lavra. It is a huge complex of buildings which resembles a medieval fortress. There are ramparts, extremely high towers, fortresses, churches, and little chapels in an enormous paved courtyard. The Catholicon dominates the entire monastic complex which St. Athanasios himself built. Two huge cypress trees stand there before it like eternal guards. Tradition states that the taller of the two was planted by the saint's own hands, while the other was planted by one of his disciples. Everywhere tidiness, grandeur everywhere. You could see that all the monks of the Lavra, from the doorman, the guest master, the sacristan, to the leaders, were living proud of their spiritual heritage. They were the children of St Athanasios, and somehow, in a certain way, fellow brothers of the Emperor Nikephoros Phokas. As I was strolling through the monastery, I thought that its great father-founder, St Athanasios, would appear from some point. I also saw something uncommon for worldly life. The gardener had placed his goods in piles according to the type, and the fathers would go and take whatever each one needed. But those who gave more picturesqueness to the custom, those who gave an exceptional tone, were the hermits. They gathered from their neighboring houses, filled their ascetic knapsacks with garden goods to get by for a few days, and left again for their hermitages. How much that picture moved me! Love above all. I also noticed that custom in other monasteries that I happened to pass by. I didn't stay long in Lavra. I was in a hurry to return to Kalyva and from there to St Anne, so that I might arrive even more quickly in the holy monastery of Dionysiou and meet the distinguished monk Father Lazarus. In Kalyva I stayed 2 days. Along with my monk friend Father Joasaph, I went by way of Karasia toward St Anne. In Karasia we visited the Kili of St John the Forerunner, where the discerning elder Joachim lived with his disciple Father Andrew. My stay in St Anne lasted a few days. I was extended hospitality again in the house of Elder Azariah. The feast day of the Nativity of the Theotokos fell in those days. One afternoon, a very pale and very stern elder visited us. As I learned later, he was Elder Gregory from the Kalyva of the Nativity of the Theotokos. He had come to invite the fathers to chant during their celebration. I was sitting on the balcony at the time. He threw me a searching glance and proceeded to the guest room. The fathers accepted his invitation, but mentioned to him that they had a guest also. Then he told them to take me with them. I asked about the group of Elder Gregory, and found out that it consisted of some brothers who had started out from America to become monks, and had submitted themselves to this elder. A very educated and devout Archimandrite stood out amongst them. He was now undertaking superhuman efforts for his monastic perfection here. His name was Father Joachim. Then I remembered what I had heard in Piraeus about the virtues, education, and entire demeanor of that man. On the eve of September 8th, we all started out for the Kalyva that was celebrating. I was entirely observant here, as I had been everywhere up to now. I was looking for the best group, for the total offering of myself to God. The strict and ascetic tone of this group attracted me. Father Joachim was the person around whom everything revolved. At a certain moment before the vigil began, he approached me, and with the politeness of a socially educated man, he asked me where I had come from, and if I wanted to become a monk. But I hid from him my deepest purpose, and answered that I would think about it. If you decide, he said, we need someone. I confess that at that time I would have given my promise to stay forever in that good group, but old Father Lazarus had created a serious problem for me. Many fathers and hermits gathered together at the vigil. The atmosphere was very moving. The fathers stood in their stalls absorbed in prayer or chanting humbly, modestly and quietly. The reading was assigned to me. I read, I remember, the homily of St. Gregory Palamas to the Nativity of the Most Holy Theotokos, which, by the way, was in the original and was a little difficult for me. Many came forward to receive Holy Communion at the end of the Divine Liturgy. After the morning meal I departed along with the other fathers with a secret prayer. If it is the will of God, let me return and stay here with this group forever. I was extended hospitality for a few more days by Elder Azariah. They were difficult days from a psychological point of view. I was torn in two between Dionysiou Monastery with old Father Lazarus and the Nativity of the Theotokos with Papa Joachim. I believed, however, that in the end God would guide my footsteps to wherever my soul's best interest was. Chapter 3. At the Monastery of St Dionisios. On the 13th of September, I started out on the motorboat for the holy monastery of St Dionisios. When we were quite close, the view of the monastery overtook me. The cells looked like they were hanging from somewhere high above the sea and cliffs. The fortresses, the bulwarks, the towers took one back to old and glorious years, when the Byzantine emperors built and enriched the monasteries. As I was climbing the cobblestone path of the monastery, on the left I came across a historic shrine which is connected to the life of the Holy Patriarch St Nephon. When this patriarch came to St Dionysio's monastery out of humility, he kept his identity secret, and followed the typicon of the monastery, according to which every novice, the first 6 months, serves as a mule herder. God, however, revealed to the abbot who the novice was, and on that spot, as he was coming with his mules, the brothers gave him a patriarchal reception, carrying the processional fans, banners, and censers. That's how God glorifies the humble, those who want to be the last of all. Mark 9:35. And in heaven surely he prepares them for a much more splendid reception. I passed through the gate, and I continued toward the Katholikon. Since the boat had already arrived early, I was able to catch a little of the divine liturgy which was being celebrated in the chapel of the Panagia. My reverence for that monastery made me see everything adorned with grace, transcending this world, from the architecture to the divine liturgy which a devout hieromonk was celebrating with such humility. I was particularly happy when I spotted at the chanter's stall my most venerable Father Lazarus, who was chanting the communion hymn. After the dismissal, I ran to kiss his hand. He led me to the icon of Panagia of the ATHOS and to the great Byzantine crucifix in the narthex. Later I begged the sacristan, the now deceased Papa Polycarp, that holy man, to allow me to venerate the holy relics. How difficult it was for me to draw away from the holy right hand of St. John the Forerunner, thy hand which touched the undefiled head of the Master, I whispered brokenly. All of this happened quickly, because the Katholikon had to close, so that it would be open at night before the vigil. Old Lazarus was holding me by the hand, and it was as if he were telling me, "From now on you will become a child of St. John the Forerunner." In a little while he introduced me to the holy abbot Archimandrite Gabriel, a wise and sensible man. He was humble, meek, and had inexhaustible kindness in his person and in his soul. He was a venerable personality. From then until today, when he is entering his 93rd year, he has held high the prestige of the holy mountain and worthily represented it with his charisma and virtue, his accomplishments, and with the talents that the Lord had endowed him as a monk and an abbot, as a spiritual father and a writer, truly a pillar of the Athonite way of life. He came from Thessaly, which has offered choice and worthy monks to monasticism. At that time he was 50 years old. He asked me with obvious interest, "Where do you come from? Do you intend to become a monk?" "Yes, Father, I came to the holy mountain to become a monk," I answered him. "May God grant you that which is in your best interest, my son. It is enough that the Lord has linked you with Father Lazarus." After that meeting, old Father Lazarus took me to the hospital of the monastery because he had charge of the infirmary. That day everyone in the monastery was fasting because at the vigil the fathers would receive Holy Communion. Father Lazarus, therefore, served me some Lenten food also. At the same time he explained to me the value that fasting has in the life of the monk. I took his words with real thirst. That hour was a beautiful combination of theory and practice. Our discussion was of such interest that we did not rest at all in spite of the fact that at night we would have had a long vigil. Early in the afternoon we had some fruit so that we would not go entirely without food. We seated ourselves on the balcony of the hospital, and old Father Lazarus opened the treasury of his soul. What thoughts these were! But what a history this man had, too. He started out from America for the mountain when he was 18 years old of age, along with Elder ATHOS, who was a monk at Papa Savas's in Karyes. His thirst for the life of holiness, for ascetics, solitude, and quiet consumed him. As a matter of fact, he had put the monastery in a difficult position with his high ascetic tendencies. The life of such people is a light which after their death shines even more, just as the light of the saints of God. We'd been talking for a long time when I abruptly interrupted old Father Lazarus. It seemed to me that I had fallen into ecstasy, as some harmonious sounds from the bell tower of the monastery that sounded like sounds out of this world reached my ears. For the first time in my life, I was hearing such ringing of the bells. It's the same thing that anyone who hears that melody for the first time feels. "Oh, Father, what is that I hear?" "The bells," he said to me. "The bells are ringing for the vigil." "The bells," I repeated with astonishment and perplexity. "Is that how the bells ring on the holy mountain? That isn't the ringing of the bells. It's heavenly music." Later, I learned that there were specially trained bell ringers who knew music and could harmonize the bells accordingly. We got ready, climbed the stairs to the Katholikon. Fathers came out of everywhere, silent shadows inside the nightfall, and entered the church. In a little while, the Katholikon filled with holy figures. One by one, the monks, wearing their habits and hoods, took their place in the stalls. The vigil started. The abbot, with all his dignified grandeur, led the celebration of the Holy Cross. After the opening psalm, the Anaxaria started. Evlogison. Translators note, it is the custom during great feasts to sing the closing of the psalm from the second half of verse 28 to the end. When thou openest, and so on. Returning to the text. Every so often the chanters alternated because the vigil was lengthy and tiring. The canonarch or prompter and the ecclesiarch in their monastic mantles walked about, eager angels inside that holy place, which living and frescoed saints had transformed into a veritable paradise. The deacon with the censer in the one hand and a small model golden church in the other, which he rested on his shoulder, incensed, following the rhythm of the chanting. Everything bore witness to a distinctive, well-thought-out order. Truly, I said to myself, the cenobium is a terrestrial heaven where the monks serve and glorify the Lord like angels. Just as St. John Climacus says in the latter. Within me, the scale was clearly leaning toward my staying in the St Dionisou's monastery. I thought that on the one hand, the monastery with its many graces, and on the other hand, Father Lazarus would be the best solution to my monastic life. We came to the latte. The abbot with the staff and mantle went first, and the fathers followed him chanting, each took his place. There I heard the deacon commemorate the names of the emperors, queens, princes, founders, and renovators of the holy monastery. How close to the Byzantine era those names and ceremonies took me. Rejoice, O life-bearing cross, I heard old Father Lazarus chanting, and I saw all this procession returning to the main church with the same grandeur. After the latte, the reading followed, and then the 6 psalms of Orthos. It was recited as usual by the abbot. His sweet, drawn-out voice, full of joy-producing contrition, still echoes in my ears. Every word colored with its meaning. Since then, for the duration of my stay on the holy mountain, I tried to be present for Orthos in the monastery of St Dionos in order to hear Elder Gabriel recite the 6 psalms. During the praises, the litany of the section of the precious cross took place with all the order of a religious procession. We were able to venerate it on the very day of its elevation. After Orthos, the usual recess followed, so that the fathers could rest. The slow chanting of such hymns as Lord, I cried unto thee, and the doxa stica and the polyelon had prolonged the vigil for 8 or 9 hours. After 2 hours, The melodious bell summoned us to the divine liturgy. It was a festive concelebration. The abbot presided, and all the hero monks and deacons participated. The climax of God's blessing was the drawing near of the monks to Holy Communion. The fathers approached with a piety that brought tears. How sharply etched in my soul some of these moments are. The abbot was holding the holy chalice in his hands. Someone chanted softly and movingly, "Of thy mystical supper." And the fathers approached after they had asked forgiveness by bowing towards both choirs. They drew near to the chalice of life, so that they may live forever and may have Christ living in their hearts. John 6:51 and Ephesians 3:17. The same chalice gave strength to the martyrs to win the victory during the early Christian centuries. That same one strengthens now the athletes of the witness of conscience, the martyrs of monastic ascetics. On such great feast days, the bell rings for the refectory, and a procession forms which starts from the church. The fathers with candles go first, then the chanters, and the abbot follows with his staff and mantle. When we all took our seats, the abbot rang a special little bell which gives the signal for the opening prayer. The reader recited the prayer high up from the pulpit. The table was blessed, and we sat down. I was surprised when I realized that the food was cooked with oil. In the outside world, oil consumption on the day of the Holy Cross is considered a serious sin, but I waited for Father Lazarus to answer my questions. From the pulpit, the reader read clearly and without haste. All the fathers bent over their food, ate noiselessly while they listened to the sermon which referred to the elevation of the precious cross. A little after the dinner began, the abbot rang the little bell again, and the reader interrupted the reading to say, "Through the prayers of our holy fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us," and resumed the reading. At that point, all the fathers crossed themselves and took the glass with wine in their hands. The atmosphere of the refectory, with its marvelous touching frescoes, the archaic wood-engraved pulpit, the plain wooden tables, ascetic benches, and characteristically short duration of the meal, created an atmosphere of prayer, silence, and simplicity, almost like that in church. But most of all, however, the living presence of the fathers, with their hoods and their silence, gave an exceptionally sacred tone to the refectory. When the abbot was sure that everyone had finally finished his meal, he interrupted the reading with a new ringing of the bell. The reader came down from the pulpit and, turning toward him, recited through the prayers 3 times. He bowed and took from his hands the traditional blessing, a piece of bread and a glass of wine. The signal for rising was again given by the superior. With one last ring, we got up for the thanksgiving. Then the so-called elevation of the Panagia took place. The monk in charge of the refectory approached the icon of the Theotokos, which is found in the center of the refectory, holding a prosphoron, holy bread used in the preparation of Holy Communion. With that, he made the sign of the cross in front of the icon and said, "Great is the name of the Holy Trinity, and most holy Theotokos, save us." Immediately after this, the bread was distributed to all the brothers, while the chanters chanted, "O Theotokos, thou art a mystical paradise," and so on. And the ecclesiarch incensed with the hand censer. In most similar ceremonies, the Axion Estin, or "It is truly meat," is chanted. All the order of the refectory ends with that brief ceremony. The abbot leaves first. He stands across from the exit and blesses those who are leaving. To the right and left kneel the monks in charge of the refectory, kitchen, and the reading. As Father Lazarus explained to me, they ask for forgiveness for their shortcomings. In about 10 minutes, everything was quiet. All the brothers had retired to their cells to rest. However, I wanted old Father Lazarus to explain to me why food with oil was served in the refectory. I was satisfied when he told me that this is done because of the fatigue of the vigil. I thanked him, and full of a variety of intense emotions, I went to sleep exhausted. In the afternoon, there was within me a firm decision to become a monk in the holy monastery of St Dionisou's, provided the elder would agree to let me stay 2 years close to Father Lazarus as his aide in the service of the hospital. This was also a trial to verify the will of God. If he accepted my proposal, then I would believe that it was the will of God for me to stay and live as a brother of the Monastery of St Dionos. Otherwise, I would become a monk in the Kalyva of Elder Gregory in St. Anne. Happy with the solution that I gave to my problem, I ran to old Father Lazarus, who was waiting for me on the balcony of the hospital. We sat on a wooden bench. Before us stretched the tranquil September sea. I told him my impressions of the splendid vigil, and finally I announced my decision to him. After listening to me carefully, he answered, "Tell it to the abbot, and if it is from God, he will accept it." Within the hour I found myself in the office of the abbot. "Father," I said to him, "do I have your blessing to detain you a very serious subject?" He received me with great fatherly kindness. I announced my thought to him, and after thinking a little, he answered me, "My son, we don't take monks with conditions. Whoever comes here surrenders himself to the monastery, and the monastery assigns his service and everything else. I'm very sorry that I cannot make you happy. If you want, stay, and St. John will provide." "Thank you, Father," I said, "for your sincere handling of the problem. This makes me respect both you and your monastery deeply. However, to be faithful to God and myself, I must become a monk in St. Anne." I bowed and sadly returned to old Father Lazarus to tell him the abbot's answer. "I expected that answer," he said to me. "I didn't reveal it to you, however, from the beginning, so that I would not tire you, but perhaps he might have accepted your proposal." From that time on, I believed that I should follow the road toward St. Anne. That night, with the same interest, old Lazarus familiarized me regarding life in a skete and more generally on the Holy Mountain. We parted a little saddened by the outcome of my situation. In the morning, during the service, we met again, and toward the end I said goodbye to him, asking for his blessing and his prayer. I waited in the little harbor of the monastery in case a boat would pass by. In a little while a fishing boat picked me up and let me out at the moorage of St. Anne, where all my desires were now focused. Chapter 4. I become a monk in St. Anne. Now I find myself in the office of Elder Gregory. Papa Joachim offers me the traditional Hagirite refreshment, while at the same time I was receiving orders for my establishment in the cell which is next to the elders. Shortly we were notified that it was ready. I anxiously opened the door and very joyfully found myself in my little cell. Father Joachim came close to me and like another trainer gave me the first instructions. "Hey, my son, for the monk, the cell is an arena. Here you have to wrestle with the devil and your passions, and you must always be the victor. In this way your guardian angel will rejoice, and the Lord will bless your struggle. From here on, then, on to paradise. With your prayers, Father, may the devil never be happy in my lifetime." I answered with emotion and kissed his dried-up hand. In a little while I closed the door and I was left alone. I said to myself, "My God, from here on towards paradise." I glanced around my little cell. Its dimensions did not exceed 2 by 2.5 meters. For furniture it had a wooden bed, an old icon of the Theotokos, and a small table next to the window. From there you could see almost the entire skete, just like from the highest point of a big amphitheater, because our Kalyva was built on one of the highest points of the skete. The view was panoramic. The sea stretched out far across the way into the depths of the horizon. An apricot tree was struggling to reach up to my window. On the small table was a glass oil lamp. At first, as I closely examined the cell, I felt malaise. It was low, dreary, and narrow. However, I quickly overcame it when I began to understand the meaning of its construction. Almost all the skete Kalyvas and cenobia have low ceilings, small cells like crypts and like nests. Such a small living area helps the monk in his attempt towards introspection and and in return of his nous within him, and afterwards to his foundation, which is the heart. This then will be my cell. I will live here forever. My prayers, studies, struggles, tears, and my joy will be here. Everything will be here. I begin today. I don't know when I will finish. Its poverty will be my companion, its past my courage. How many passed through here? How many prayers, how many prostrations, gladsome mourning, what blows with the tempter, the noetic Amalek. Perhaps my cell at one time entertained monks who, having fought the good fight, finished the race and kept the faith. 2 Timothy 4:7. And are today saints in the church triumphant. After a cursory tidying, I went to see the elder. He was cheerful, and with a smile, which one seldom discerned on his stern face, he said to me, "Stay a while until the Simantron rings for vespers." A short time had elapsed, and a young monk about my age, Gregory, I heard his name, entered the office, bowed down before the elder, and then very cordially greeted me, welcoming me. He wished me stability and patience. The Simandron called us to the chapel of our Kalyva for vespers. It had a humble but imposing environment, old stalls, ancient icons, plain oil lamps. 2 fading vela closed the holy gate and the northern gate. The elder showed me the stall I would be using for the services. The prior's stall belonged to Father Joachim. With his indeflectible, prayerful stance, his ascetic form, and his long and full beard, he adorned the sacred place like a Byzantine icon of an ancient saint. Young, curious, and still the stranger that I was, my glance roamed everywhere, so that I might become familiar with the new surroundings. Vespers ended without my realizing it. Plain, brief, vibrant, and also filled with contrition. Father Gregory, the youngest brother, ran to prepare the refectory. The sun had not set yet when we sat down to the evening meal. Everything impressed me, and I wanted to learn everything, if possible, from the first day. And in the refectory I was a meticulous observer. I observed how and what they ate, how they faced material nourishment. Sunset found the elder and me seated on stone seats outside the Kalyva, close to the hesychastic cell which, because of its isolation, was called katamonas in Greek. "How do you like our place, George?" "Very nice, Father." "From here onward to heaven, my son." "With your blessing, Father, I want you to help me." "Of course we will help you, with the grace of God. Besides, that's why one goes to a community, so that the elder and the brothers might be of assistance, so that the former might succeed in his God-pleasing purpose." I heard the elder's words with attention and satisfaction. Now, he continued, "I'll give you an original tour from up here, and I'll acquaint you with our skete. Here down below is the Kalyva of St Eustathios. Down further, that of St John the Forerunner. Still further down, that of St Seraphim from Fanar. More to the right, that of the Holy Apostles. Opposite, that of the Presentation of the Lord. Straight down, as we can see, we find the Kalyva of the Archangels. Directly below the Kyriakon of the skete is the Kalyva of the Ascension, in which old Nicodemus the Cypriot is the elder. Over here, on the right side, live the iconographers, Kartsonas brothers, and down low, in the Kalyva of the Holy Cross, the community of the brothers Ananias, which numbers approximately 11 brothers. In the center of the skete, as you know, is the Kyriakon, which is honored by the name of St. Anne, who, after Panagia, is the protectress of all of us here. Her holy relic and miraculous icon make her presence especially felt among us. My elder continued talking to me a long time about the skete, the holy mountain, monks, and orthodoxy, and I listened, insatiably enjoying it. At times I watched his enthusiastic face. At times I turned my gaze towards the depths of the horizon, pondering what muck I had left behind in the world. And again at times I would stoop down in front of me on the ground, to the ground under my feet, and I would think what a priceless pearl I had found upon. I thought, what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his life? Or what shall a man give in return for his life? Matthew 16:26. Monks strive the best bargains. They lose a little and gain much. They forfeit a little and obtain a lot. They scorn the temporary and prefer the eternal. They renounce the terrestrial and store up treasure in heaven. Luke 18:22. With the passage of time, my awareness of the immediate as well as the broader environment became continually more complete. The elder was a strict monk, unmercifully harsh with himself, unyielding in his monastic principles, relentless. The fact that he had served as a captain in the Greek army contributed to that. However, underneath all this, he had a simple, pure heart full of love. Father Joachim was a hero monk with impeccable behavior, a true aristocrat, but at the same time a violent monk. His superiority was an expression of his internal spiritual life, but also a vestige of the distinguished position he had held for many years in America as an Archimandrite. The culture of that man daily gained my admiration. I have written about Father Joachim in the first volume of the series Contemporary Agurite Figures. The elder often said to me, "Laddie, watch Father Joachim. He is one of the few monks of our time who lives his monastic life with consequence." Father Stephen came next in rank, a young monk who came from Sparta. He spent his childhood and youthful years in America. There he met Father Joachim and was devoted to him so faithfully that he followed him from America to the Holy Mountain. When he first met him, as he was telling us, he thought that this man was an extraterrestrial being, that it was impossible for a mother to have given him birth. Father Stephen had great bodily strength at his disposal. That's why many times the elder entrusted him with the heavier chores of the house. Elder Paisios, also from America, was Father Joachim's spiritual child. Illiterate but faithful, a zealous monk, he was our gardener. Father Gregory was a little older than I. The elder had given him his own name because he esteemed him especially. He was young, with a burning zeal for the cultivation of his spiritual life. He was a harsh fighter with unrivaled self-denial. He followed Father Joachim faithfully. At that time, we were also taking care of two little old men in our group. My elders had taken them into the house so that they could spend their last years with some comfort, because they had lived a long time in solitude. This brother-loving gesture is customary on the mountain. When someone becomes old or sick and is not in condition to take care of himself, or other fathers take care of him. They consider this a great blessing, and they take care of him until his death with all their love. "20 days after my arrival at our Kalyva, the elder and I started one morning for Kyries. We went to the Kali of the Karambelas brothers who made vestments. The elder, named Christopher, was from the Near East. It was a serious, closely knit group, with unceasing prayer, work, and silence. They took my measurements so that they could make me a robe, cassocks, and whatever else was needed. We stayed there for 2 or 3 days so that we could take them with us and not have to make a second trip. It was a distance of 6 hours on foot from our skeet to Kyries. When my monastic garments were ready, we started out for St. Anne. My emotion was great. On the road, I thought I was holding a treasure, a uniform of honor. The fathers of my time gave great importance to the outer appearance. It was unthinkable to them for a monk to keep something which would remind him of his former life. No shoes, socks, no worldly clothes, underclothes, watches, or anything else. Everything had to be different, monastic. What wisdom this facing had within it. If today's monks paid attention to it also, how the novices would be helped. One Saturday, therefore, during Vespers, I made the appointed bow and put on the monastic garments. The fathers were all chanting together, as is the custom during the service. The festive Doxastic unto the Virgin Mary, the universal glory begotten of man. Now I was a recruited soldier in the army of the Lord. I enlisted informally, of course, in the ranks of the novice monks. My formal enrollment in the registry of the Skete would take place a little later. In these first steps of mine, the presence of my strict elder and the saintly figure of Papa Joachim gave me courage for the harsh ascent to monastic life. As soon as I put on the rasa, the elder wanted to have our picture taken together so that I might send it to my family as an expression of my definite decision to follow the monastic life. The picture was accompanied by the following telegram: "I've decided to stay on the holy mountain. That is why I put on the cassock. Don't fight the Lord, lest you fall into the hands of the living God." Hebrews 10:31. The content of the telegram was such as to put an end to the ordeal which tortured them and for me for so many years. That ordeal was due to the fact that I was an only child. My father Michael was killed in Asia Minor during the tragic retreat of the Greek army. Therefore, my mother was left a widow after only 34 days of marriage. The role of protector and guardian was taken by one of my uncles, a naval officer. In our house we constantly had quarrels, spankings, and threats. I had repeatedly received 40-1 lashes, 2 Corinthians 11:24, both from my mother and my uncle, for my persistence in the monastic ideal. But as usually happens in similar circumstances, my uncle revised his attitude later and treated me with great respect up to the end of his life. However, God's special blessing for me was my mother's change. She didn't simply surrender to the will of God, but she desired to receive the monastic schema. Indeed, I myself, toward the end of her life, was able to become her elder and spiritual godfather, tonsuring her a nun with the name Macaria. Therefore I am at ease, having within me the knowledge that our very merciful Lord, overlooking the times of ignorance, Acts 17:30, now grants them a foretaste of eternal gifts. Chapter 5. My first confession on the Holy Mountain. Since you decided to stay on the Holy Mountain, you must go to the spiritual father for confession, the elder told me one day. Our spiritual father, Christopher, was a hesychist in Carulia, the most representative place of the Hagurite desert. With one of my spiritual brothers, we saddled ourselves with the knapsacks filled with food for the ascetics of Carulia, who are deprived of everything. We, glory to God, had all the worldly goods. Our first stop was at the Kalyva of the hymnographer Father Gerasimos. I was happy to have met that man. I had met him in Piraeus in 1935, a respected and dear person for me. His joy also, however, was obvious when he saw me, now on the holy mountain with the monastic garments and with all the Hagurite distinctive signs, knapsack, cane, heavy shoes with soles made of automobile tires. But most of all, he was happy because God had led me to a strict and ascetic group. I looked at him with admiration. He was the contemporary hymnographer of the Greek Orthodox Church. His hymnologic talent attained greater value as he cultivated it in that desert corner of Little St. Anne. "So it's your first confession on the Holy Mountain," he said to me. "You're going to a spiritual father with a great deal of discernment and holiness. Take care to prove worthy of God's gifts." We received Father Gerasimos' blessing, we thanked him, and proceeded towards horrifying Carulia. We reached the place past which the only helpful means for us to continue our trip was chains, huge cliffs, abrupt drops, and below the sea, deep ink black and savage. I was crossing through Carulia for the first time, and I couldn't imagine what I would find. But neither was I so decisive for such acts of bravery. Fortunately, the brother who was accompanying me dispersed my cowardice and helped me. After the first dangerous crossing, we found ourselves in front of 3 little huts. "Here," my spiritual brother said to me, "is the hut of St. George, where a very educated Russian, Father Nikon, a former officer in the Russian army, lives as a hesychist." We knocked on the door and waited.
Shortly there appeared an all-white, saintly figure with a heavenly smile and kindness that seemed of another world. We left him some food, and kissing his saintly hand, we received his blessing and continued our walk. Farther down was the second hut with another Russian hermit as a tenant. This ascetic observes silence, my fellow traveler informed me. Indeed, he opened the door without speaking to us at all. He only bowed deeply, a sign of greeting and gratitude for the offering of our love. We didn't even exchange a word. Submerged in prayer and in silence, surrendered to God's mysteries, who knows how many years it had been since he had spoken. But we also respected the sacred bima of his silence. We quickly greeted him and left, allowing him again to live alone with his Lord. Within that unrestrainable babbling of this world, how that martyrdom and mystery of ascetic silence stands out, how the Holy Spirit rests in it. A little to the right of the second Russian hut, almost on the side of an enormous cliff, was mounted the hut of the Greek ascetic Father Bartholomew, a man with rich expressiveness, with spontaneous and disquieted love for his fellow man. Truly, how great is the variety of the gifts of God! The Lord rests in the most differing characters and grants his grace to all. Father Bartholomew was so thin that one thought that one was looking at a skeleton. A few connected bones covered with a thin, fleshless skin. His eyes, however, were luminous, filled with childlike innocence. I had seen him for the first time during the feast of our Kalyva on September 8th, 1938.
In front of his hut was an almond tree. All around the rocks, the sage leaves smelled sweetly, while the wild birds accentuated the silence of the desert with their monotonous, sweet and happy sad voices. Below, the sea, sometimes still, as if numbed, but with an uninterrupted purling, sometimes uneasy and agitated, and in the midst of these surroundings, Elder Bartholomew, the skeletal hermit. Go on, my little brother, go on to be cleansed of all the sins of the world, so that you may become a pure child of our Panagia, he said to me at the end and bid me farewell. In a little while we arrived at the hermitage of the spiritual father. It was dedicated to the Nativity of the Lord. When we came out of its balcony, fear and agony seized me. Directly below us, chaos and the sea, the Black Sea. Father Simeon, his disciple, directed us to the room of the spiritual father. We found him lying on a wooden couch. He was infirm in his lower extremities. He lifted himself up to greet us, and bending down, he bowed to us. "Welcome, my children, sit down. Welcome, my young monk," he said to me. "Did you come for confession?" "Yes, Holy Father, for my first confession on the Holy Mountain." For the first time I was seeing our spiritual father as well as his hermitage with the small cells. In the eastern corner of his room hung a wooden chest with paper icons and a little oil lamp burning in front of them. On the little table there were manuscripts with scriptural and patristic selections. Non-acquisitiveness and marked poverty prevailed everywhere. "We live here in this little palace," he said to me when we were alone. "We see the sea, too. The Aegean stretches out before us. From time to time big fish pass by, whales, sharks, and playful dolphins. On this balcony on good days, we get a little sun." "Sit," he said again, and he showed me a stool. "Our place here is inconsolable. With the exception of a few prickly pears and wild almond trees, we have nothing else. And the wood that we need for our necessities, we transport even that on our backs, going up and down these cliffs. Have you confessed another time, my child?" "Yes, Holy Father. My first confession was made when I was 12 years old to a Russian hieromonk who was a refugee from Russia. Later, however, I had Father Paisios as my confessor." "Ah, well then, this confession of yours nevertheless is a landmark in your new life.
We must then re-examine ourselves in order to be better informed and to know ourselves more thoroughly. And now let's begin. Please shut the window and kneel down here before the icon of the Lord. I knelt down. That confession then had to cover all 18 years of my life. The priest put on the stole, lit a candle, and began the service of the sacrament. When he finished, he gave me some prayers, which he had excerpted from the old codices, which referred to the sacrament of Holy Confession. I began to read carefully, but they were so soul-stirring and corresponded so much to the emotional and psychological state of those moments that I wasn't able to finish. Never in my life at the time of confession have I felt such a burst. My tongue could not articulate a word. My hands trembled, and with them the prayers that I held. "I'm waiting for you, my child. Don't hurry," the Holy Father said to me, but it was impossible to continue. My soul had been shaken to the very foundation. I begged him to interrupt the reading a little until I could recover. With patience he worked his prayer rope, and when I took hold of myself and read the rest of the prayers, he said to me, "Now, my child, recite before the Lord whatever sins you have committed from the time you remember yourself until now." My God, what a confession that was. In the presence of the Lord, who was hearing and seeing me in Carulia of the Holy Mountain, and with a confessor, a spiritual father who, from the time he was in Volos, was famous for his asceticism. I poured out all of my wretched sinfulness with painful soul. In the end, I noticed that the spiritual father had teared. He didn't ask me anything. He didn't ask for any explanation. I had told him everything exactly as it had happened. "And now let us read the prayer of absolution," he whispered. "But don't you have anything to tell me, to advise me in something, Holy Father?" "No. Here on the Holy Mountain, advice and instruction are assumed by the elders, who are responsible for the monk. We simply perform the sacrament. Prepare yourself to receive communion at Christmas." I bent over almost to the ground so that he could read the prayer of absolution over me. "No, my child, not so low, a little higher so that my hand might rest on your head. That's how you must receive pardon. Before I left, the confessor told me that he is in the habit of imposing a stiff penance on the novices. He prevents them from receiving Holy Communion for quite a while after the time they come to the Holy Mountain. But when he sees pain and true repentance, he lessens the period of time of the penance. We were then in the middle of October. At Christmas, then, I would receive Holy Communion. Later, he also asked the other brothers to come in and expressed his joy and enthusiasm. "George is settled. Now let's wish for him to become a good monk." I stayed yet a little while in our spiritual father's hermitage, enjoying his spiritual companionship. We drank hot mountain tea and returned with wings on our feet and heart. "Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow." A new life with a pure soul was beginning from now on. The hut of our confessor was always a well of spiritual strength and replenishment for our souls. I won't omit relating a very instructive event that I experienced when I went there another time for confession. As I was going down the cliff holding the chains, I met a certain well-known monk who was climbing up. He was the disciple of a discerning and very monastic elder, according to Hagurite terminology. We greeted each other with the usual greeting, "Bless the Lord." Shortly, I was knocking on the outer door of the confessor. I realized, because he was lame and had a particular type of step, that he himself was coming to open up for me. He received me with a lot of kindness, and he treated me with the usual treat of Carulia. After confession, we went out a little to the frightful balcony. It appeared even more frightful, not only because its firmness did not inspire confidence, but also because the fearful view of the Black Sea of Carulia created in me an inner uneasiness. However, I had my spiritual father close to me, and this gave me courage. I perceived that on that day something had tried him, something had saddened him, but he didn't delay in revealing it to me. Today I went through a difficult time. Before you, someone else had come for confession, and he grieved me greatly. He had misbehaved at some point in his life and came to confess it without having revealed it to his elder. He even asked for my consent to conceal this sin of his. I naturally refused to hear his confession, and I said to him, "You will go first, tell it to your elder, and then you will come here to confess to me." And so he left, very saddened. That incident was an opportunity to probe the thought of my spiritual father. I knew that something very good would come out of this. "Holy Father," I asked, "how do you handle something like that? How do you place it within the life of the monk?" "Listen, my child, our God is a God of order, not disorder. The sequence of things in this case in question is as follows: God, elder, disciple. Our church has lived this order from the time that the Holy Spirit, through the Fathers, organized monasticism as a special spiritual system. We even correlate the sequence of this trio, God, elder, disciple, with the Old Testament trio, God the Father, Moses, Israelites, respectively. Whatever God gave to the Israelites, he gave through Moses. And the people, on the other hand, would ask through Moses for whatever they wanted to receive from God. You must know," he continued, "that all the statutes governing the life of the earthly church are founded, on the one hand, in the Holy Scripture, which comes directly from the Lord Jesus, and on the other hand, in the Holy Spirit, who guided and guides the church in all the truth." John 16:13. Through the Holy Fathers. My child, if you see brotherhoods and monasteries waning, this is due to the disturbance of this God-given order. Blessed are those monks who called their elder God after God. When I refused to hear his confession, the brother about whom I spoke to you in the beginning left very saddened. However, never would I have wanted him to leave happy. If I satisfied his desire, in other words, to confess to me his sin and to conceal it from his elder, he would have fallen into a very basic monastic transgression. Certainly I would have surrendered him over to Satan's authority. I am hoping, however, that he'll understand it soon and repent. Then I'll also make you a participant of this joy of mine, because surely you must be saddened even though you don't know him. I didn't want to put the spiritual father in a difficult position, which is why I didn't reveal to him that I had already met him. I realized that something like that would wound him spiritually. It was impossible for him to imagine that a circumstance existed for us to meet, because by right the road that the brother should have followed was to pass by on the opposite Carulia and to come up by chains. This is what the spiritual father had in mind, and with that basis he revealed to me the brother's situation. However, when I returned to our Kalyva, I related everything to my elder, because it was inconceivable to know something which is not known to him. Chapter 6. Our Group as a Spiritual Nursery. My life now inside our Kalyva was rolling along quietly, under the blessing of God and the prayer of my venerable elder. I felt that everything there was akin to my soul, which embraced it longingly. The personality of each brother exercised its beneficial effect on me. Every movement, every word, every expression of theirs marked the course of my new life. I struggled, too, as much as I could to follow them in their hard struggle. I was still a beginner. Every night the elder received my thoughts and followed with a great deal of interest the states of my soul. I took my first steps in the monastic life. I needed daily support. As I said, my cell was next to the elder's. He was accustomed to studying after the compline. Many times when he came across a certain passage which would edify me, he called me. I remember one such occasion. When he called me, I found him absorbed in study. I waited a little, standing, until he motioned me to sit down. "You listen too, my child, to what I am reading. Maybe you have not come across it, or if you did come across it, you might not have given it the attention due it." He read to me, therefore, a most beautiful excerpt from the life of St. Andrew the Fool for Christ's sake. There the saint described how he saw paradise, when one winter night the snow had covered him, he was snatched in the spirit from the present world to the land of light. In that passage, the saint tries with human words to describe the indescribable, and with scenes from the present world to give a picture of the future one. That passage had so moved and overcome the elder that at one point he interrupted the reading, closed the book, remained speechless for a little, and continuously wiping his tears, said to me, "Think, my child, what things await us, what no eye has seen, no ear heard, nor the heart of man conceived." 1 Corinthians 2:9. What a life we will live in heaven. What we will see, what we will hear, what we will taste, and yet how small and insignificant our attempt is for its conquest. In your life, don't ever lose this direction. Whatever you say, whatever you do, whatever you think, measure it with the standard of eternity. Never become faint-hearted. Don't shrink before the climb, the toils, and the sweat of the dedication. You have to give much, to give everything, whatever you have and don't have, to purchase, like a good merchant, the priceless pearl, the kingdom of heaven. With these words, the elder strengthened my will, raised my spirit, and when he assured himself of this, he sent me to my cell to rest. It was a rainy, windy night. All the fathers were resting quietly, but I could not close my eyes. St. Andrew, the Fool for Christ, had stimulated my mind. Whirling around in my mind were the elder's thoughts, his tears, the desire for heaven, the obstacles, the relentless struggle against the passions and the devil, the thorny march toward the heavenly Jerusalem, my brothers, our skeet, the holy mountain, our church militant and our church triumphant, eternity. The hours passed by and I wasn't able to sleep. From my window I looked out at all our skeet, which was plunged in darkness. Here, I would think, in the first line of battle with rational enemies. I was a new recruit. I was just starting out. I wondered if I would reach the end, the victory which I dreamed of as a child. A few vacillations popped up within me. The genuine monks gave blood and received the Spirit, while I managed to do the same. I don't know how long that struggle of thoughts lasted. This was a usual fight in the contest of ascetic strugglers. It stopped when my heart abandoned itself with trust to the mercy of God by the unceasing invocation of His name. I felt, without being sure of this, that a light sleep overtook me, when in the endless silence I heard a very harmonious choir chanting very sweetly, very festively, very excitedly. The Hiermos, praise the King of heaven, whom the hosts of angels praise. How splendid was that hymn, those heavenly voices. I had difficulty orientating myself in the beginning. It was hard for me to get my bearings, to believe that I was in my cell. Without realizing it, suddenly I dissolved in tears of contrition and joy. In the morning after the service, I ran immediately to the elder, and I related the incident to him. "The only explanation which I can give you," the elder answered me, "is the effect of what we read yesterday about St. Andrew." I thanked him and busied myself with my usual duties. However, for a long time that supernatural melody echoed in my ears and sweetened my heart, even though it had resulted from a subjective substratum. The daily spiritual direction was undertaken by Father Joachim, the heir of our Kalyva. He was a marvelous instructor. His love followed us in every step. He took advantage of every opportunity to reinforce us, very polite but at the same time inflexible in his principles. Being the youngest, they had assigned me to the duties that I could handle, washing dishes, sweeping, etc. Father Joachim coordinated every duty with wisdom and order. At the same time, he would try then to turn each duty into a chisel which shaped our character. Many times when I was washing dishes in the sink and winter was severe and my hands stiffened from the frozen water, he would draw near to me and with love would say to me, "My little one, winter is bitter, but paradise is sweet. Enduring hardships and pain will release us from our evil self and our passions." The presence and speech of Father Joachim refreshed my struggling youthful soul. Other times, however, I turned a deaf ear to every human consolation, and I didn't feel comfortable. What truly goes on inside the soul of a novice? What trials, what agonies, what temptations, what attacks of the devil in order to cut off, to avert the journey toward the angelic life? When the novices fight and win, they are the greatest heroes. That first year, I remember it was very difficult for me when the time came to pick olives. That chore fell at a time of an intense battle with egotism, my old habits and vices. Every afternoon, therefore, I was tortured by an insufferable headache. Since I was in this condition, I asked the elder to busy myself with other chores. He accepted my plea easily. Then I took charge of the cooking and cleanliness of the Kalyva. When the blessed Father Joachim was informed by the elder of my plea, he devised a plan. The olive trees were in the area of our Kalyva. When it wasn't necessary for him to be present, he would come to our Kalyva and would approach me cleverly, trying to help me. On one such occasion he said to me, "So, does your head hurt, little one? Did you get a little oil from the lamp of Panagia to cross yourself so that it will go away? You must go and even say the hymn to her nativity." "May it be blessed," I answered, and did what he told me. "Did your headache go away now?" "No, Father," I answered. "Then it's not the head. Something else must be wrong, because our Panagia here is a doctor and cures all the illnesses. Maybe you should come and pick olives, even for half an hour, and then leave." At first I heard his proposal with indifference. At night, however, along with the thoughts of the day, I related this incident to the elder also. "Go, my child, a half hour. Let's be obedient to Father Joachim," the elder said to me. In fact, the next day I started out along with the other brothers for the olive trees. A half hour had gone by when Father Joachim, who in spite of his sickly constitution was gathering olives in the bitter cold, approached and said to me, "How's your head doing, little one?" "It doesn't hurt me." "Then stay another half hour yet, and then you can leave." When the half hour elapsed, he said to me again, "Do you hurt at all?" "No, strange thing," I said. "Well, go to the Kalyva now and do your other chores also." With the inductive methods and love that characterized Father Joachim, I worked in the olive trees for 1.5 months without again being troubled by headaches. The gathering was followed by the transportation of the olives to the olive press, with sacks on our backs, and after that the pressing. In the olive press we turned the stone by ourselves, night and day, and that way we ensured our oil for that year also. The olive press was in primitive condition. The fathers didn't want to change the way that it operated. They preferred hardship. Here one would see 1 or 2 brothers turning the stone, while another one, seated aside, worked the prayer rope, reciting continually the prayer, "Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me." It was a scene out of this world, graphic in appearance, but harsh in essence. The other fathers were close to the straining bags, to the olive pits and to the boiler, where the water was boiling to wash the crushed olives, while the darkness of night fell little by little. This was repeated every year. It was a scene which reminded one somehow of that prison of the penitents, as St. John of the Ladder describes it in his Discourse on Repentance, the Ladder, chapter 5. In the upper floor of our Kalyva there was a big bay window from which you saw the entire skeet and the open sea. A rich light spilled into it. For that reason, Father Joachim and Gregory used it for iconography. I tried once to become an iconographer. The blessed Father Joachim was instructing me. I would make the very first sketches, some big eyes, mouths, noses, etc. He wouldn't tell me that any of them were ugly. He always gave me confidence. After a few days, however, I gave up the attempt in spite of his encouraging words. Later, I asked Father Joachim, Father, while I was making those silly sketches, real caricatures, why were you telling me that they were going well? Little one, we should never discourage the beginners. I was taught some such principles of education in a college in America, and noticed that when I came here, I ran across these same conclusions of psychology and education, the fruit of many years of scholastic research, in our patristic books, which were written primarily by monks many centuries before. However, these conclusions do not stay printed in books only. They are carried out in practice, and especially by elders of limited book learning who have a great deal of experience in monastic training. I saw their application here on the Holy Mountain and by the present-day monks. Father Joachim often advised me in a unique way to be a good housekeeper. Little one, he said to me once, whenever you use a tool or a utensil, like this knife which you left unwashed and unwiped, after you finish your work, you should clean it, kiss it, and say to it, I thank you, my little knife, for serving me. In this way, then, you may put it back in its place. The precision and the schedule in our daily life, as Father Joachim had spelled it out for us, bordered on the absolute. Our motto was, all things should be done decently and in order. 1 Corinthians 14:40. Chapter 7, Scenes from Life in our Kalyva. In our Kalyva, we didn't have an animal for transportation, but we had the blessed pack animal of love called Father Stephen. Saddled with an enormous knapsack, he would climb the hill from the moorage, praying the Jesus prayer most of the time out loud. The fathers of the skeet were aware that Father Stephen was coming, because his well-known voice was heard from afar. Kyrie Jesu Christe, eleison me. Often, no matter what subject he was talking about, he would insert the prayer with simplicity, indifferent as to whether the person with whom he was talking found himself many times in an awkward position. Sometimes when I would approach him with admiration and respect, wanting him to say something beneficial to me, he would note, It's enough to be saved, Father George. I hadn't become a monk yet, and everything else is secondary. And immediately he continued, Kyrie Jesu Christe eleison me. In character he was hard, in behavior unaffected, straightforward, and never smiling. A dreadful monk, you'd say, if you didn't know him better, and yet he had an unbelievably sensitive soul, filled with love and tenderness. On the Holy Mountain, characters are smoothed out, simplified. They reject the masks, the worldly formalities, and hypocritical politeness. They become sanctified in the font of spontaneous, unfeigned love, which will tire you greatly to discover in the outside world. I shall never forget the love and self-denial of Father Stephen. He wanted to always wear the cheapest clothes in our group, to do the heaviest work, eat the worst food. He gathered the leftovers from the day before, put them in a small bowl, poured water in it also, and ate them unperturbed. Old Father Paisios, the tease of our group, would often tease him. Hey, say there, Father Stephen, do you remember the good food we enjoyed like kings in America, now that you're eating that water pap? Father Stephen shook his head condescendingly, almost indifferently, emptying, however, his ascetic bowl with such relish, as if he were eating a delicious dinner. The Kalyva was for him a little palace of heaven, which surpassed in comfort and happiness the skyscrapers of America, and his food the most delicious in the world. The disposition of his soul was such that it made him feel like that. As often as Father Stephen went to Daphne, the port of the Holy Mountain, he was in the habit of bringing me something like a gift, a blessing, since I was the youngest of the group. He would come without my realizing it, leave it in my cell, and depart. He thought that in this way he was softening the struggle and was helping me in my adjustment to the life of dedication. Father Stephen was also the bearer of my mother's gifts and of those of my relatives and acquaintances. At that time, the line Piraeus Thessaloniki Kalyva was made by the ship Kirkiyar Vlogison. The boatswain on that ship was Mr. Spiridon Duratsinos, known to our family and brother of that special nun Synclitiki, abbess of the Holy Hermitage of St. Christopher of Aegina. Every time the boat would pass by Daphne, he would bring something as a gift from my family, usually pastries, baklava, or katif, because these keep. When the package arrived at our Kalyva, the elder would give a piece to each one of us. He would send the rest with Father Stephen to the fathers of the Skeet, and especially to some little old men who lived alone. When the brother returned, he would describe to us with what joy they received this unusual gift. They would give thousands of blessings. Where could they find, and even more, where could they taste such pastries, since from their arrival on the holy mountain they had never left it? Once Father Stephen went to Carulia to offer some of my mother's gifts to the ascetics. He returned, however, thoughtful and bewildered. Almost none of the fathers there accepted the gift. All of them answered him that these things were inappropriate in the Carulia. Someone even rebuked him for daring to make such an effort to offer to the hermits. We were amazed. We thank God that in our days, too, there were hermits with complete self-denial. One time when Father Stephen went to Daphne to shop, he bought the wrong thing. When he returned to the Kalyva and the elder realized the mistake, he called him and scolded him harshly, and he stood straight in front of the elder with head bowed, speechless. When the scolding was over, he fell prostrate at the feet of the elder and asked forgiveness. "Forgive me, forgive me, forgive me," he said as he was accustomed with his voice, as if hitting his inflexible character with a sledgehammer, stressing the final syllable, me. His repentance softened the elder's position, who grieved a lot for each of our transgressions. But with the admission of the error, he changed completely. Not only did he forgive, but also increased continually the expression of his love. On the shore of the Skeet lived Uncle John the fisherman. He came from Mytilene. He wore a monastic scufo, had a beard and long hair. He was lame, over 60 years old, and he waited on the fathers. One day Uncle John brought us a few pounds of fish. The elder thanked him and gave orders for someone to clean them outside of the Kalyva so that the sink would not fill up with scales. Being the youngest, I hastened immediately. However, I didn't think about the cold that was so bitter, so that everything around was frozen and the faucet barely dripped a little water. My hands froze and hurt unbearably. I was forced then to continue cleaning inside the Kalyva. Father Joachim saw me, approached me, and said to me, "Little one, why did you come in?" "Father, I couldn't stand that frost and the cold water." But the elder gave orders for the fish to be cleaned outside the house. His orders should have been carried out without any objection and excuses. Father Stephen, willing worker and tireless servant to all of us, heard this dialogue. Without losing time, he came close to me, grabbed the bowl with the fish, and with eagerness and dexterity indifferent to the cold, he cleaned them all. I confess that the heroism of his soul and his love are unforgettable to me. His hands had frozen, but the scriptural love beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things, 1 Corinthians 13:7, had become for Father Stephen a way of life. I looked at him petrified, without being able to articulate a word before his self-denial. The monk must die several times a day when his obedience demands it, Father Joachim said to me. Now you've lost your wages. Father Stephen has taken it in its entirety. Yes, I saw it too, but more than that, I saw that this brother was a resurrected monk, because he had died in the flesh and matter. Every monastery, every Kalyva practically every isolated Kali on the holy mountain has its garden, too, where winter and summer vegetables are cultivated. The service of the garden is undertaken by a monk who has the corresponding knowledge and the respective experience. We had Father Paisios as our gardener. Father Paisios lived most of the years of his life in America. As a layman, he lived a strict Christian life. This man's characteristic was his rich and spontaneous love. Many Greeks abroad hastened to confine their difficulties in him. They ran to him to solve all types of problems, especially financial ones. In the Greek Orthodox circles of the immigrants, he was known as Uncle John. Free from familial obligations, single, he was devoted body and soul to Father Joachim, whom he adored. That's why when the latter came to the Holy Mountain, he followed him unhesitatingly and loyally. He was sweet in his ways and willing to serve, humble as well as meek. Already in his 60s, when I caught up with him on the Holy Mountain, he had, as I mentioned before, the obedience of the gardener. During his days, our garden enjoyed great glory. It was unrivaled. He worked hard, like all the fathers, of course, in the gardens of the Skete. Because the ground was sloping, the senior monks had formed big terraces and filled them with dirt, which they had transported on their backs from afar. Thanks to their toils, we now enjoyed the blessings and the harvests of the gardens. Father Paisios took care of the fertilization. He went up into the forest, and there, under the thick foliage, gathered rotten leaves and suitable dirt. He carried it all on his back. Thus our garden, supplied by plenty of water from the Skete, had choice vegetables. Father Paisios was full of childlike qualities and simplicity. With great zeal and spiritual thirst, he followed the readings of the refectory and the church services. The Jesus prayer was never absent from his mouth. It was his most loved occupation. It's worth it still to mention his spontaneity, especially in the confrontation of the demonic attacks. Many times, very many times, we were forced to run to the railings of the yard to see what was happening. What's wrong with old Paisios? Is he fighting angrily with someone else? Hey, old Paisios, asked the elder. What's the matter with you? Why are you yelling? What's the matter with me, Father? He would answer. That most wicked one won't leave me alone. He meant the devil. In addition to that name, he used other names in his vocabulary to rebuff him. He would read him the riot act and spit on him. Pooh! Get away from me, he would say with simplicity. Pooh! Pooh on you, wicked one. All right, but what did he do to you? The elder asked him jestingly. Here, he came now and reminded me. And what didn't he remind me of? The nice life of America, he says. The enjoyable food, the comforts, all the good and bad things of America, people and things, vain recollections and sly memories. Pooh on you, you most wicked one. All right, the elder would answer him. Be patient. That's the work of the devil. To harass in every way the one who walks on the road to God. And with what else will he harass him, but by means of people and things he had known and lived in the past? Old Paisios also told us charming little stories from the outside world, which strengthened within us the value of the monastic life. Well, I followed and learned the wiles and the ruses in the mental, invisible battle that the noetic Amalek, the most wicked one, used, according to old Paisios. And I would remember St. Anthony. He saw, so he said, the snares of the devil spread out on the earth, and he marveled. No monk is exempt from this warfare. Consequently, I wasn't left out either. Many times the warfare for separation from my mother was relentless because I didn't have a brother or sister, and I never knew my father. I was practically an orphan from the womb, as they are accustomed to saying where I'm come from. However, with the grace of God and my elders' blessings, no temptation could move me, no thought was able to bend me, nor even to remain in me and to stay my course. But the enemy would not surrender. I remember it was spring. One afternoon, I was sitting in my cell. I was studying, when under my window I heard the exact same voice of my mother. George! George! That moment I felt a strong chill pierce my whole body. Automatically I opened the window and looked out without realizing that my mother's presence on the holy mountain was physically impossible. Excited, I ran to the elder and told him of the incident. Astonished also, he let escape from his lips those unforgettable words for me. Malevolent devil, you used even that method to fight the novice? Return to your cell, my son, and recite the salutations to our Panagia. Through all the time of my stay on the holy mountain, those moments after the demonic attack were perhaps the most difficult. While I was reading the salutations and trying to follow their deep and heavenly meaning about the divine incarnation, in my ears continually would re-echo my mother's voice, George! George! That bloody prayer finished, I went again to the elder to inform him. All right, don't be afraid. At night all the brothers will work a prayer rope on your behalf for God to help you. I too recognize that it was one of the most underhanded attacks against you. Working along with his monks, the elder used to always weigh things with absolute exactness and not to overlook the reality of the specific battle of each of his novices, for reasons supposedly instructional. He was discerning and objective, and this gave us a lot of courage. A long time had gone by when I received a letter from my mother, who mentioned that on that very same afternoon, according to the calculations we made, she heard my voice at the front door of the house. Mother! Mother! Terrified, taken aback, she went down to the yard thinking that I had returned from the holy mountain. But when she didn't see anyone, she couldn't explain the incident, and crying, she went back into the house. She was asking, therefore, for an explanation to be given to her problem. The elder read her letter before the whole brotherhood, and we were all astonished by the ruses of the devil, how, in other words, he does everything possible to prevent a soul from dedicating itself to God. The battle is waged continually, and continually it is necessary that the soldiers of Christ arm themselves with weapons, for we have fleshless enemies. St. Simeon, the New Theologian.
Ανάξιος δε πάλιν, ον ευρύ θυμούντα, βλέπε ουν ψυχή μου, μη το ύπνο κατενεχθείς, ή να μη το θανάτο παραδοθείς, και της βασιλείας έξω κλείστης, αλλά ανάνυψον κράζουσαν, Άγιος, Άγιος, Άγιος Υιό Θεός ημών, διά της Θεοτόκου ελέησον.